Hello. I'm sending this because you said we should lay our burdens onto you. I don't know exactly what you meant, but this incident has been weighing on my mind. It feels like a burden and I don't have anyone else I can tell it to. I've been watching your videos for a while now and I don't know exactly what they're really about. Yet my story feels relevant. Somehow? Maybe? So I've been getting back into exercise this year. I made it one of my goals to lose some weight. Mainly I've been going to the gym, watching what I eat, stuff like that. One thing I always loved to do was walking, so tried working that in to help build up my cardio. Not far from where I live there is a small country road that leads up a steep hill. It's pretty deserted most of the time. My plan was to park somewhere at the bottom and walk up to really get the leg muscles working. It was a clear sunny day the first time I drove there and I found a small divot on the narrow road just before it began its steep incline. There was just enough room to pull my car in without obstructing traffic, if there was any. I recall looking up and kind of dreading this task I'd taken upon myself. The top wasn't even visible because of the way the road twisted and turned upwards. But I was determined. That first time was tough. I was breathing heavy, my legs were burning, and there were many times I just had to stop to catch my breath. I was really out of shape. There was quite a few times I had second thoughts. Just turn back. I can get to the top another day. Yet I persisted. When I eventually reached what could be considered the peak, feeling ready to collapse, I was immediately energized by the view. It was amazing. Rolling green hills dotted with lakes, a few vast forests towards the horizon and beyond, a haze of blurred shapes under the glaring sun. The only sounds were that of nature, chirping birds, buzzing insects, and just the faintest hum of a farmer's tractor from somewhere unknown. I sat down on the edge of the road sipping my water, taking it all in, elated that my determination had been worth it, thankful that the journey down would be much easier. While massaging my legs, I began to spot the various properties and houses that lay scattered on the landscape. I tried to find my own and it took a few minutes. Just a tiny white blip among the green, which I assumed was the glare of the sun on the roof tiles. Then as my eyes wandered further, I saw the town. I call it the town, and not a town, because it is the reason for me writing this. It lay just to my right, which I later found out was north, a good distance towards the horizon, in the middle of a large forest. I could make out numerous buildings grouped tightly together, but not much else due to the shimmering haze. At the time I didn't give it a second thought. As the weeks went by, I was proud of myself that every walk up that hill was getting easier. I'd time myself, shaving minutes off my previous attempts, was stopping less frequently and couldn't wait until the day I'd do it all in one go. With my mind less occupied on the task at hand, it began to wander onto other matters. Just the small stuff I'd been putting off, like property upkeep, a car service, getting my debts in order. I'd been letting a lot of things slide. Sitting at the top of the hill though, I began to wonder about the town. The township where I work and do my shopping is in a completely different direction and much further out. You can barely see it from that hill. But the town, I couldn't remember anyone ever talking about it. Couldn't even recall an advertisement or something from a business there, or an event taking place. How could I have been living so relatively close and never been there? I'm not from the area originally, only moved here 5 years ago, but that's more than enough time to know about something like that. What was the name of the place? Would my neighbors shed some light on this mystery? I know. It sounds like I was making a big deal out of nothing, and, to be honest, my life before getting into shape consisted mostly of going from home to work, then work to home. It was possible that I just never noticed. So I decided to treat it like a mini adventure and drive up there some weekend. Just for a day out. I even put off searching on Google, choosing instead to make the trip blind. I had to wait a few weeks for some free time after that initial idea. We were very busy at work and everyone was required to do some overtime. I remember just counting down the days and planning out my route. Finally, on a clear Saturday morning, I was kind of excited sitting into the car, ready to hit the road. When was the last time I went for a leisurely drive? I thought. Over 3 hours later I found myself on a small road with the forest whizzing by on both sides. It was very narrow. 2 cars wouldn't be able to pass, and didn't look like it saw much use in a good long while. I remember it being mostly straight with no abrupt turns, just the constant view of the tall pines ahead. My anticipation of suddenly coming across a turnoff leading to the town grew less and less as the road stretched on with little to no change. It certainly didn't look like the way into any sort of densely populated area. Finally I got to the end, coming to a T-junction which is where the forest ended. I could see on both sides that this road led along the edge of it. I must have spent another couple of hours driving around in a big circle, discovering that the route I was taking followed the entire perimeter of the forest. There weren't any signs or markings that indicated even a way into the town. The trees were so tall I couldn't see the tops of any buildings either. Eventually that original small road came back into view. I turned onto it again to take a second look. After what must have been another half hour, I pulled over with frustration and got out my phone. I have to be missing something, I said half mumbling. So I opened Google Maps and searched the area. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. After double, then triple checking I was looking in the right place, there was nothing listed. I even made sure my location settings were correct, but no, according to Google, the town was not there. The street view didn't show anything either. I ran through some scenarios trying to wrap my head around it. Was it possible that an entire town was never listed? Was it just overlooked? Was it abandoned? Was it some secret military operation? Though those are usually just blurred out. No. This was strange because even abandoned towns and those military bases have roads leading to them. Maps just showed one continuous line cutting straight through the forest, the route I was already on. I put the phone down trying to collect myself. I knew I hadn't imagined it. It was there every time I climbed that hill. Suddenly I felt this renewed curiosity. This was a mystery, a genuine adventure. So I started up the car and took off with a plan of action. Drive around that perimeter road at a steady pace, keeping an eye out for anything I might have overlooked. Not much of a plan, but enough to keep me going. I must have circled the entire thing twice by the time the sun was setting. I'd stopped to investigate anything that seemed out of the ordinary quite a lot. Most were just these small breaks in the tree line that could have been an old entrance or something. I'd walk in for a bit to find they all ended the same though, a thick heavy brush with no clear way through. No other traffic appeared on those roads in all that time too. With it getting dark, I'd have an even harder time searching. So headed for home. That night, I barely got any sleep. I rechecked maps again, and after that failed, searched up the history of the area but didn't find much. Then I lay in the dark thinking about what the town was, coming up with all these crazy scenarios. The one I kept coming back to was that it must be abandoned. Not the most exciting option, but the most plausible. The next day I made my way to my local hunting store to pick up some binoculars, then drove straight up the hill. It was a clear morning, so visibility wasn't an issue. Sure enough, after I looked in the direction of the forest, The town was sitting there, same as always. I pulled out the binoculars and with a bit of adjusting, it came into focus. The pair I'd picked up were 10 by 25, which the guy at the store had told me were fine for sightseeing. They gave me a good enough view of the place, I suppose, but made me wish I'd picked up a bigger set. Still, I could make out some details. High-story buildings with the sunlight glinting off their windows. Some smaller flat tops in between. I think I could even make out some streets too. Something that looked like a square. Nothing was moving that could indicate traffic. I'd need a telescope for a closer look. One thing that stood out to me was that there was no signs of decay. If it was abandoned, it was in pretty good shape. I decided to drop it for the day. I was still tired from the night before and would need to get at least 8 hours sleep for work come Monday. All during the following week, I was planning my approach. When I'd finish with work, I'd drive up to the hill and take notes. Drawing rough diagrams of where the town was situated. Figuring out where that road cutting through was. My guess, which turned out to be correct, was that it must be south of where the town was. I tried to imagine where the best place would be to park my car for the shortest hike into the woods. I even asked a few neighbors about it, making up excuses for calling over. I don't talk to them much, just a friendly wave now and then. They all looked at me strangely when I brought up the subject. As far as they knew, there was nothing there, just some woods. I didn't feel comfortable enough to invite them up the hill to have a look for themselves. By the time the weekend came around, I was well prepared. Hiking boots with a backpack. GPS locator. Just in case. The guy at the hunting store recommended it. A day's supply of food and water, a compass, and my phone fully charged. It was midday by the time I was parking on the forested road in a spot I thought would be best to set off from. This was in July, so there was another 9 hours, or so, of daylight, which I felt was plenty of time. There were no trails through those woods, making it a tough excursion. I had to take regular breaks. It would have been way tougher if I'd not been exercising regularly up to then. I kept my eye on the compass, making sure I was always heading in a northerly direction when the terrain would allow it. Most of the time I was climbing upwards at a steady incline. There were a few ravines I had to avoid and walk around, some fallen trees to climb over, and a small stream I followed for some time. During one of my breaks is when I noticed that things were very odd. I'd pulled out my phone to check the time. Just past 4. I'd give it another hour before going back, not wanting to be out there in the dark. The phone battery was way down, more than it should have been. While trying to think what could be draining it, I realized that things had got quiet. There was no wind blowing through the trees. There was no chirping of birds or even the hum of insects. The only thing audible was my own breathing. I glanced around to see if there were any signs of life. Not even the black darting of a fly. This is when it struck me. There was something off with the trees. I don't know why it hadn't occurred to me up to that point, but they looked wrong. It's hard to explain. Like they grew unnatural, tilting off at an angle, as if being pulled towards the center of something. The trunks weren't twisted or bent by heavy winds, and the leaves, from my vantage point, didn't seem to be resting in a natural way compared to the angle the trees were sitting at. Almost as if someone uprooted perfectly straight trees then stuck them down at some obscure angle. I could feel chills creeping up my spine. Yet the curiosity of getting to the town was winning over. I know it sounds crazy. Every instinct would tell a person to leave, get the hell out of there. Self-preservation. I knew this. I know this now as I'm writing. But at the time, there was just this compelling urge to continue. So with a little more caution, I followed those leaning trees deeper into the woods. The further I went, the more the trees leaned over. It got to a point where the tops were in view when I'd stand just a small distance away in front of them. Then, when it seemed like they couldn't get any more horizontal without falling down, there was a break in the foliage. I had arrived at the town. The concrete and tarmac just began where the forest ground ended. 2 tall buildings stood on either side of me and various others in front. I was standing in the middle of a road that ended abruptly. I got the feeling that all other roads would be the same. The first thing that stood out immediately as I gazed around in awe was that everything looked to be abandoned, derelict. The walls of the buildings were cracked and crumbling, full of ivy and other jutting plants. Many of the windows were broken, spare shards hanging in their frames. The streets weren't any different. Some parts were so bad, you wouldn't get a car past. Yet I could have sworn it hadn't looked this rough through the binoculars. It only served to add to the increasing strange and bizarre atmosphere. At this stage my phone was dead, as well as the GPS. I had no watch so couldn't tell the time. I knew though that even if I headed back straight away, there would be no getting out of the forest before dark. I didn't like the idea of trying that. I also wasn't thrilled about hunkering down in one of those buildings either, but it seemed the more favorable option. So taking a good visual note of my entry point, I headed in to explore. Here's what I recalled during my initial search. First, this did not resemble a town in its layout. It looked more like a few city blocks had been transplanted into those woods, complete with old rusted street lights and broken traffic signals. All street signs were too degraded to read. What I'd thought might have been a square turned out to be a particularly large junction. Second, the place was like something you'd see in one of those post-apocalyptic films. All falling down, decades old. And yet, the buildings looked modern. Third, it was dense, or at least it felt dense. As if the area was bigger inside than it looked on the out. But I couldn't tell for sure. After walking a good way in, I cursed myself for not using the compass. It had completely slipped my mind. The thing was useless though, because its needle was spinning wildly. I tapped the glass a few times but no change. I didn't want to try and figure that out too, so just stuffed it back into my pocket. Whatever that place was, it didn't obey the laws of magnetism. I won't get into any of the theories I had at the time because, to be frank, none of them account for what I saw. Inside many of the buildings were old furnishings, rusted appliances, smashed TVs, broken sinks. Not any that looked from the 70s, 80s, or 90s. Again, modern looking. Just old and worn by time. Some of the buildings were too dilapidated to enter or go anywhere above the first floor. Stairways crumbling or elevator shafts empty. I went from one to the next, exploring as much as I could. All of them just seemed to have been ordinary places of business, living areas, stuff like that. Various items such as ragged clothes, empty food cans and decayed books lay strewn about. Very creepy and very weird. The thoughts of having to sleep somewhere in one of those husks for the night seemed like a worse and worse idea. Still, before I knew it, the daylight began to fade. Most of the buildings in my immediate area were heavily dilapidated. At that stage I must have been somewhere in the middle of the town, so doubled back in the direction I came in by. The dark was coming in fast. A small torch I'd brought along had also stopped working. The few random doors I tried were locked up tight. I shouldered one and it didn't budge. An edge of panic was rising inside me. I told myself to calm down. It's no big deal. I'll find some place soon. Anything would do. Then, while carefully walking across some broken tarmac to the other side of the street, a sound broke the silence, far off in the distance. It was very faint, but I could have sworn it was a scream. Heart racing, I rushed over to a small structure with a sign overhead saying it used to be a computer repair shop. I can't remember the name of the place now, but in the dark, the faded black print on a dirty white background was hard to miss. Just before the door was within reach, a weak light suddenly blinked on from inside. I skidded to a halt, frozen like a deer in headlights, one thought rushing through my head. I'm not alone. I must have been standing there for a good minute, frozen with indecision, until my legs began to move. There was no sign that someone inside had noticed me. The idea that anyone lived there was hard to believe. I crept over to the repair shop's window, peering through the dirty glass. From my point of view, I could see that the light was coming from a back room beyond an open door. It looked like it was emanating from behind a large shape. While trying to figure out exactly what I was looking at, the shape moved. Off to one side, revealing a computer monitor behind the source of the weak light. My heart beat even faster. That was a person. Before I even had time to take all this in, another scream echoed out in the distance, closer than the last. I can't describe it fully. Like that whole place, there was something off about it. Thinking on it now still gives me chills. It came from above. Hollow, and full of anguish. And it didn't sound like just one scream, but many, overlaid in a single horrible burst. A quick glance back inside the window revealed that the figure was looking straight at me. I took off running, adrenaline taking over. There was no particular direction, I just ran. I had to get out. I'd been a fool and was going to die in that place. My legs were burning and my heart was racing as I darted from one street to the next. I wanted to slow down, think it through. Try and figure out the most direct route to the tree line. But my body would not let up. It was in full fight or flight mode. Blindly making my way down a narrow alley, that horrible scream sounded again, closer still. I tripped up on a piece of debris exiting the alley, falling heavily on my hands and knees. Instant pain shot up through my arms and legs. The dark stain of blood on my palms was clearly visible as I shakily got back on my feet. Wiping the sweat from my stinging eyes, I frantically looked around. To my left and directly in front, the streets continued on. Buildings lined up on either side, fading into the night. To my right was much the same, except the concrete tower seemed to end abruptly with a large dark blob behind. I strained to see more clearly. That must be the tree line. It has to be, I reasoned with a panicked hope. Then that scream echoed out again from right above. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, straight in that direction. That fucking scream rang out again. Closer still. No thought was in my head except to get to what I hoped was the way out. Dodging and weaving between deep cracks and holes on the street, I got another surge of energy when I could see it. The tree line. It was lit up with a dirty orange glow, slowly getting brighter. The long dead and rusty street lights were on. The scream came from right behind me as I gave one final push. My feet abruptly left tarmac and hit soft earth. I didn't stop. I kept going, avoiding the leaning trees, leaves and branches hitting my face and body. Still I didn't stop. Not until I fell again, sliding down a small drop. My side slammed into a tree trunk, knocking the wind out of me, and I rolled over in pain to lay on the damp soil. The pain subsided to a manageable level eventually. With no sign of that scream, I slowly sat up. My breathing had calmed somewhat, heart not jumping out of my chest. I felt incredibly tired. A careful check of my side assured me that while very tender, probably bruised, there didn't seem to be any broken ribs. I knew it was best to keep moving though. On shaky legs, I pulled the compass from my pocket, praying that it was functioning again. Thankfully it was, so I slowly headed south, using the torch, which was working again also, to light the way. When dawn had begun to chase the dark away, I'd left those leaning trees far behind. All looked to be just your normal forest again. My hands and knees needed seeing to, so I found a fallen tree to sit on. Both were heavily scraped but nothing too serious. I applied some disinfectant which stung like hell and wrapped them with some gauze. The sun was visible through the canopy by the time I pushed my way through some bushes and found myself on the road. I had to pick a direction. It was 50-50, so headed right, hoping it was the way to my car. At this stage my water was almost gone and I had a single energy bar left. My feet were aching and I was walking with a heavy limp. I couldn't help but think that the night had seemed very short. Many times I thought about turning around to walk the other way. Nothing on the road looked familiar. After every bend which revealed another long stretch of tarmac, I'd tell myself one more. On the next bend, I'll turn around. But I just kept going. Which was good because eventually the red car paint came into view off in the distance. Through my exhaustion I managed to quicken my pace. First into a light trot. Then despite the pain, a jog. I was practically sprinting the last few feet to the car as I slung my backpack off, landing it on the hood to retrieve my keys. Sitting inside I got the first good look at myself. Scratches and dirt covered my face. Dried blood was caked on my left temple from a cut above my hairline. Bits of leaves and soil were embedded in my hair. I was a mess physically and emotionally. I turned the key and got the hell out of there. At home, a long shower took care of all the grime and dirt. My side was marked by a heavy dark bruise. I wrapped it and took care of all the little nicks and scrapes. My hands and knees were badly chewed up and would take some time to heal. Finally I collapsed on the bed and slept till 3 the next day. After getting something to eat, I fished out my phone from the trousers I'd been wearing. The screen was cracked but it still worked after the charger was plugged in. A few missed calls from work awaited me. I ignored them. There would be time for that later. I sat for a long time, going over everything in my head, trying to figure it all out. I kept going back to that scream. I'd heard it before. I pulled up your videos and went to transcript 31. It was there. Not the exact same as I'd heard. Maybe that has something to do with the recording? What was that thing? Can you tell me? I only know that if I hadn't have got away, I would be dead. It wanted me dead. It hated me. That I am sure of. I made up a story about how I'd gotten lost in the woods while camping when my work colleagues asked. As close to the truth I felt comfortable sharing. It was the end of that week, after work, when I made my way back up to the hill. I felt ready. Heavy white clouds dotted the sky, a change in the weather was coming. Stepping out from the car, a light breeze cooled my skin. I'd brought the binoculars with me, but didn't need them. Laying eyes on the forest revealed what I expected. The town was gone. Where it once stood was now covered in trees. Just one continuous terrain. As if it had never been there at all.